I was working in the woods today here at the main Edible Acres site and cleaning up some branches and debris and just taking a look at some of the frozen waterways. We've had some pretty good, definitely deeply below freezing both days and nights, no direct sun. So the ground's seizing up pretty well. Snow is persisting, and as I walk around I'm seeing small hand-dug ponds from the past that are completely covered with ice. It's kind of neat to see the creatures moving across them and how different beings are trying to interact with it. But I noticed something interesting in this one area where there's water that's completely thawed out. I want to take a look at it and come up with some ideas of what might be happening there and what we might be able to do with that from the information we're getting. So I think it's going to be a little hard to convey this in the video, but bear with me. If you can imagine, so this little hand-dug pond area that I'm circling there, I dug that about 6 or 7 years ago and went down about 2 or 3 feet, so very small. But what I've noticed of all the ponds I've dug in this landscape, that one in particular stays the fullest, the longest. And if I zoom out here a little, you can see right now I'm looking west and south a little, and it goes upslope in that direction. As I pan to the north, it's hard to see with all the brush, but the landscape also goes up ever so gently. Eventually it crests and starts coming down again to the northeast, but that's a separate watershed. In this particular area, what I think is happening is that this small pond is either being charged from the ground up or is benefiting from an aggregation of all the water in this part of the landscape, and it may very well be spring-fed to some extent. Now, I'm not going to say by any stretch that I'm some pro with all this. I would love to hear folks' comments and suggestions of why this particular water body might stay fullest longest. Comment below, let me know. But what I've done is taken the information from that of this pond staying reliably full, a really excellent source of water for wildlife during the fall and spring. And I dug a trench and extended it on contour, doing so just by eye. So as I dug down and out, I let the water chase and follow and kept going until this little pond extension was done. And I deposited all that soil down slope. So this is a swale, or a swale, and a hugelmound. There's some old branches and logs buried in there under the soil. And this stays wet quite a bit. Now here's where it gets really interesting to me. This last season I took this pond, reliably full of water, and dug out a mini channel going a little bit deep so it can get around this bend, coming over the crest of this little bend, and then letting it bleed out into the landscape into an area that normally isn't very hydrated. And what I'm seeing is that right in this area, that is liquid water. Now, why? I wonder, I suspect that what's happening is water is pushing up into these ponds from the ground, keeping them filled, and they're overflowing underneath the ice, ever so gently, but a gentle, continual moving stream is moving through this channel, coming out into the landscape, and then descending back into the soil down in here. Now what I'd be really interested in doing is, can I take this channel where there's this moving water that is surprisingly not frozen in the landscape and dig out a more gentle, broad scoop to allow this whole area to fill with water this time of year. Maybe it'll dry out in the summer, and smooth out this channel so that flow and access can happen through here. In other words, wheelbarrows or mowers can go over this without hitting such an intense bump. So that's what I'm going to chip away at. And since we've got the snow, I'm going to use a sled and some buckets and a shovel. That's about all the ingredients I need. And I'll fill the buckets with soil and stack some functions and use that soil to cover these young hugelmounds that are all throughout the woods from this winter's clearing. So let me do a little bit of digging and then we'll chat some more. Very light, rough sketch there, just done with the tip of the shovel. Again, I'm down slope here and I'm shaving a more gentle entryway into this waterway, taking all of the soil, putting it in these buckets, and I'll descend or send this, I'll descend and send this downslope on the sled. Once it hits the snow, it should be pretty easy to move and skirt around. And there's a pile of ash branches that came down from a few trees to make this area more open. Last couple weeks or so I cut these up. And so what I'll do is dump all the soil on these and these other parallel beds to move them along. There's certainly a fair bit of water behind this system, or upslope, that really does want to express and release. Every time I go in with a shovelful, a little bit more silty water moves down slope and into this. This is what I talk about with the idea of using water as a level. So if you can do your earthworks and your shaping and your swale refining and your bed making in the frozen or high water table months of winter, it will give you absolutely instantaneous feedback as to where the water is going to move. So right now, as I shave a little further down, this is becoming a little extended pond rather than a running ditch. I don't want to go any deeper than this because I'll start getting into the roots of this grandma white pine, and I certainly don't want to dig on her side of the ditch. I might shave just a little just to smooth that out. For those of you that are wondering, that's my glass water bottle. But the idea now will be on a very shallow way to extend this ballooning water out further, and now I'm wondering, can I get it to, instead of pouring over just out to there, can it split, come down into this landscape and run along a hugelmound so that it can rehydrate that or wick water up into those branches? And can I have it, as it's going down slope, make a switchback somewhere in here to deposit silt and water out into this more open, potentially productive area? So it's kind of like adding a serpentine switchback sort of vibe to this thing. So I'm going to chip away at that a little bit more. It's as spread out as I'd like it to be. It's going a little deeper, and now the cut, instead of overflowing this way, I'd like it to gently overflow that way, but with an excess run, scoot back that way. Been noticing lots and lots of rabbit and deer manure in the woods here, and the thought of, fingers crossed, that this can hold open for them as clear, unfrozen drinking water deep into the winter. If we could accomplish that, that would feel really lovely. So yes, they're tough, they hurt our trees and all that, but the thought of them being this cold in the landscape and thirsty is pretty tough. So I'd hope we can get a nice, wide, easy entry drinking trough for them, if that works too. Bonus. Having been cut out to here and then cut slightly downslope and back again on contour, it very readily wants to fill up this bottom area. In fact, it'll want to drain out a lot of the water that's in that area. So once this is shaped and I'm sending it back, the water diffusely back into the landscape, in fact, towards those hugelmounds so they can wick water into themselves. Once that feels functional, my goal would be to go back in and actually bank some soil in here just a little bit so that it can help keep the water level in this whole area full. And I can always take that out to flood irrigate those areas, or when this swells after a heavy rain, it would naturally overflow and send that way, overflow and send this way. So just ways of making the water switch back through the landscape as many times as possible. You can see it's all just coming off of those original cuts, which took a bunch of years for me to get the information that I needed in order to start this whole process. That's all for the digging for now. Now it switches back over to observation mode, maybe just a little bit of interaction. But what I want to avoid is going through and digging so deep, so aggressively, cutting trenches really wide and all over the place without giving the water time to slowly and gently equalize. Part of this whole thing, again, is about slow it, spread it, sink it, and taking this stored water level, which feels very reliable, and distributing that water level as far out as possible. And I believe that this switchback right in here will be where silt will accumulate when we get really intense rain events. So I'm going to watch for that with the idea that I can harvest those silt deposits and put them onto adjacent hugelmounds where they'll be useful. So I have the last sled worth of 4 5-gallon buckets. Another yield from this is all the capping material for these hugelmounds. They're still raw and immature, but they're moving in the right direction. I may be able to seed them out this spring because of this little bit of trenching work. And I am seeing positive info that the overflow is moving gently, slowly down into this area without dropping the water level much, if at all, in here, just kind of equalizing through these two levels. And we're going to let this work its way out. It's moving, creeping as we go. In fact, if I were to just kind of sit here and let this play or record for a minute or two, I'm sure it would hop over and keep going. But this sort of very slow, even bleed out and equalizing is what we want, instead of running, cutting, fast-moving, flowing water. Every time it just slowly creeps and swells, we know we're infiltrating more water in the landscape, more nutrients are staying where they need to be. And strategically, again, you can see this cuts right past a hugelmound where it can soak in that excess water when it's there. Likewise, a minor trench might run along this hugelmound to let that soak in. But long enough video. Thanks for sticking with me through this. Hopefully it's helpful. Let's have some dialogue. What makes sense about what I'm talking about here? Where are there questions? And as you see what I'm doing, what do you think could be better? How could I be doing this in a lot more elegant way? And of course, this is a really rough shave here, but we're going to let that fill in and settle and then adjust later. So we'll look at this again, maybe after some thaw or some spring rains, and see how it's performing and see how it evolves and gets more complex. Thanks for watching.